All right, welcome back everybody to another episode. I guess these are episodes, another lecture, another instance, whatever the form here, of not so traditional grammar. I'm Ross again, bringing you these videos from home here with my little baby in the other room. And last time what we talked about is a bigger picture concept. We were working a little bit more abstractly and we were comparing traditional grammar, which is what you guys have been learning up to this point, with modern conceptions of what grammar is within the study of linguistics, which we saw was a bigger order thing, right? That traditional grammar largely dealt with what linguistics calls syntax and to a lesser extent morphology, where grammar within linguistics includes a bunch of other things. So we were looking big picture. Today we're going to shrink that scope a little bit. And because traditional grammar deals largely with what we term syntax within linguistics, we're going to make that the comparison instead today and compare traditional grammar with modern syntax, which is honestly a better comparison. I wanted to hit the previous point in the previous lecture because it uses the same term grammar. But here we find actually a more, in some ways valuable, more apples to apples comparison comparing traditional grammar with modern syntax. These are both systems for describing the rules with which we build sentences in English. Both traditional grammar and modern syntax, that's their domain. So now we're finally sharing a domain. So that's today. I can show you a little bit more. Let me get to the right screen here. The plan is to do sort of this lecture in three pieces. First, we're going to look at some differences in approach or goals for traditional grammar versus syntax. Then we're going to look at what the actual nitty-gritty work of syntax looks like. I'm not going to get too much into what traditional grammar looks like. That's what you guys have already been doing. But I am going to bring up what the actual work behind modern syntax looks like so you can compare it to what you guys have been doing. And then we're going to step back at the end of the class and ask questions about what bigger picture contributions things like traditional grammar and more specifically syntax have to offer the world if we want to be nice and grandiose. So that's the plan for today. We're going to get after it. We're going to start with this first point, looking at what the goal is of each of these two things. And the two things, I'm going to use that as shorthand, the two things are traditional grammar on one side, remember, and syntax on the other. So what are the goals of these things? Well, the goal of traditional grammar, it's difficult to say what goals of something that are that's this large of a field is in just like a simple fragment or the few minutes that I've allotted myself for this slide here. But I'm gonna say that traditional grammar in practice has been largely focused on education. This may not be the only thing that it does. In fact, traditional grammar has a long history rising out of like ancient Greece and the Romans after them, etc. You see a lot of Latin influence, in fact, in the way that traditional grammar is taught. And often what those scholars were doing was looking at describing language in a more scholarly study with a little bit less educational focus. So there is, I want to give some credit where credit is due, there's a descriptive element to traditional grammars and the style of traditional grammars, which is looking to describe what they see in the language that they're looking at. But especially more recently, the focus of a traditional grammar has been on education, on teaching people, a system for teaching people how to speak and how to read and write these languages properly. Again, with that little bit of prescriptivist edge there on how to do it right or correctly. But that's the goal. That's largely what traditional grammars have been used for over the past few hundred years, at least. And this is different from the goal of modern syntax. Modern syntax I like. This is not, there's probably more eloquent renditions of this goal out there that exist. This is me spitballing it. But what I see as the goal of syntax, and I'm not alone, can be nicely encapsulated in the following, right? The goal of syntax is to create a system of rules. Again, that should remind you, you should be thinking system of rules for language, that's grammar. And that's right. So the goal is to create a system of rules which is capable of generating every single possible grammatical sentence. So all the good prescriptivist, all the good sentences of a language like English, and the rule system should not over-generate. That's to say, it shouldn't generate any ungrammatical sentences. That's the goal. Make a system that can give us all the grammatical sentences and not give us any ungrammatical sentences. That's nice. That's a nice rule lovers rejoice in such a thing, right? It's nice and demonstrable as well. It's provable, it's testable in these hypotheses. If we have a rule system, and I'm going to show you one in just a minute here, we can then test it against this goal. Can it generate all of these sentences of English? Yes or no? We can find out. Does it generate sentences that aren't grammatical? And we can test that as well in various ways. A quick aside here when we're talking about grammatical versus ungrammatical sentences. What does that mean and who gets to decide? Well, essentially what this comes down to is asking native speakers of a language if a sentence sounds good or not. If it sounds good and would be produced by a native speaker of the language, then it goes in the grammatical category. And if it sounds bad or wouldn't be produced by a native speaker of the language, it goes in the ungrammatical category. This is just testing through things like elicitation. So I can write on my little slide here like the happy professor went to sleep. Bam. And then I ask you, as speakers of English, is this a good sentence or a bad sentence? And you say, all right, that's good. And I put it in the grammatical box. And then I can test you with a different sentence like this. Oops, without typos, hopefully. Oh, really bad. Like this, the professor happy went to sleep. And then I can ask you, is this grammatical or not? And you're going to say, boo hiss. That's no good. And I'll put that in the ungrammatical box. So what our rule system is going to want to capture is be able to produce all of these sentences and not be able to produce all of these. So the grammaticality issue here is determined by native speakers' intuitions. That's our little aside when we're talking about grammaticality. It's the intuitions, it's the captured intuitions of native speakers that we're after. Okay, cool. So we have this difference in goal here. To recap, the goal of traditional grammar being educationally focused, and the goal of syntax being encapsulated in this little blurb here. All the grammatical sentences, none of the ungrammatical ones. Another point, which I should bring up, is that when I say a language, so right here, right, every possible grammatical sentence of a language, I mean a specific language, like French or Japanese or Russian or Chinese or Arabic or whatever the language is. It's for a specific language. It's what we're going to call little L language. It's just, one of a number of languages. It's not capital L language like all of language. No, it's specific to a language. So we're going to have the syntax of Japanese, for instance. You can see this book on the left. And every language is going to have its own syntactic structures to work with. Just some background here of how we're talking about these topics. Hopefully that makes sense. I realize I'm talking quickly, I'm going quickly. Again, put me on half speed if you want, or pause it and come back, or whatever you like. That's totally fine. Cool. Whew. What does a system of rules look like within syntax? And what do we mean by a system of rules? Well, we mean, this is kind of blurry, you can't really see this super well, but what I want to say is that we mean this very literally within syntax. It's very concrete from the bottom up. It doesn't take anything for granted. So here are literal rules for the English language written out in a syntactic format. And I'm going to give a disclaimer. I'm going to take this off the screen so you don't get distracted by it. A disclaimer for this whole lecture is that I'm going to talk and I'm going to show on the board, on the virtual board, a reasonable amount of kind of complicated syntactic formalism. You're going to see a lot of rules. You're going to see what we call trees here in a minute. I'm showing that to demonstrate the points that I'm talking about. I'm going to use these formalisms to demonstrate a few points about modern syntax. But it's not my goal that you learn these rules. Like on this next slide, you don't have to just memorize all these things or even really know what it's trying to tell you. I'm going to tell you what you need to know about it, and I'm using these as a prop. Occasionally I'll reference them. I'll point to these different rules or something and tell you what you need to know about them. So don't get lost in the formalisms as we're going through. And definitely don't copy things down or take notes on the formalisms. Nope. I'm going to tell you everything you need to know, and occasionally I'll reference those things. All right. So here's just an example. And what I hope you get out of this example is how explicitly concrete these systems of rules are. So what this is trying to tell us, again, very generally, take a look at Rule 8 here. This S stands for sentence, and it says a sentence produces a noun phrase and a verb phrase. Sweet. So it just tells you in English, when you have a sentence, it's made up of these two components, a noun phrase and a verb phrase. And then when we come up to a verb phrase like this, we can say a verb phrase is composed of a verb. And so every piece is composed of other pieces till you have it all laid out. And so you can just follow this from the top down here. I don't know why it's Rule 8, but S is the top node, and every other one of these rules falls in line to produce sentences of English. And again, reiterating our goal, what we want from a system of rules like this is to be able, from these rules, to be able to build all the sentences of English that are grammatical and none of the ungrammatical ones. And I'm not going to get into details of how this works, but this is giving us a rubric. You can think of it like a flow chart, right? So we start here from S and we go from S to NP, VP, and then we can just look for where an NP is, rule number 1, and we go to NP, goes to a determiner and an N apostrophe. That's called an N bar. And we just find the next one and we apply the next rule, and on and on and on until we get till the end. Cool. What these produce are sentences. This is a different depiction of that same rule system. You can see that here, this S, that rule that we looked at before. S goes to NP and VP, just like it said over here. S goes to NP and VP. So these system of rules here create sentences like this. Let me shrink myself real quick. So with that system of rules I just presented to you on the previous slide, we can create this sentence, the angry bear chased the frightened little squirrel. That is a grammatical sentence of English, so it is doing its job, at least in this one very small, with this one very small piece of evidence. And we could test to see if this rule, a system of rules, can accommodate every single grammatical sentence of English. These are called phrase structure rules for what it's worth, and this is I'll reference these as syntactic trees. You'll see a few more simpler syntactic trees later on. Bam. Okay, so that's the main goal of syntax, this one here. A system of rules generating every possible grammatical sentence and not generating any ungrammatical ones. But there is a secondary goal, possibly, depending on who you ask and whose form of syntax you do here. There's the possibility of a loftier goal of syntax, which is to create a system of rules that works not for little L language, for individual languages like French and German and Russian and Swahili, but to create a system of rules that works for all language, capital L, language, right, that works for all of human language. That's a bigger order pursuit that some syntacticians engage in. And this is often called universal grammar. It's a grammar system, a system of rules that works for everything. We're going to talk about this later when we talk about the bigger picture implications of syntax and what it has to offer, us. But keep that in mind as well, that while the primary goal of syntax is a system of rules for individual languages, there are people that yearn for more. And we'll talk about that at the end of today's lecture. All right, we're getting off it. Hopefully you know what the different goals are. Now we're going to get into what syntax actually looks like. Again, I'm not going to dive into what traditional grammar actually looks like. Hopefully, you already know that. And you already saw some of syntax in these two slides here with this system of rules producing this tree here. As a disclaimer, both the things that I've already shown you in terms of those phrase structure rules and those trees, and what I will show you it's a certain style of syntax. I'm giving you a certain lens. There's many different types of syntax, many different rule systems which linguists have tried to accomplish said goal of all the grammaticals and none of the ungrammaticals. The goal is shared in these different approaches or frameworks of linguistics, but the style and the actual implementation of rule systems looks different. The one that I'm going to talk to you about today and showcase, demonstrate a little bit, is called generative grammar. It has been traditionally the most popular style framework for, or brand. There's actually several frameworks within generative grammar. It's been the most popular one for about the past 60 years or so. It's actually starting to fade a little bit in popularity, but still it's what the majority of linguists do. Take English 375 if you want to know more about other styles of grammar. We don't have time to get into it, but I wanted to make you aware that this isn't the only possible way. I'm only presenting one way there. And one of the primary tenets of this style of grammar that I'm going to showcase to you is that grammar in this conception is hierarchical, not flat. So we're not dealing in flat structures, we're dealing with hierarchy. There's going to be layers with subgroupings and subgroupings within those subgroupings and subgroupings, sub, whatever. You got it. It's not flat. I'll show you what that means right now. So if we take a sentence like this, which we read kind of flatly from left to right, here's a sentence, Samir likes pizza. It's all kind of on the same literal line here. Syntax and generative grammar is going to break that down and say it actually looks something like this here on the right. Samir likes pizza. And you can see the different levels. Here's a top level with your S. We talked about this rule already that's branching it into an NP and a VP. You can think of this as a secondary level, and here's a tertiary level, likes and pizza. And you can see that what this hierarchy buys us in some sense is subgroupings. You can see that likes pizza here is all under the heading of this VP. VP here stands for verb phrase, because this is a verb here. And noun, NP stands for noun phrase. S for the record stands for sentence. So we can see that this is broken up into two primary subgroupings, NP and VP. VP itself is also broken up into two things, a verb and a noun phrase. So from that flat structure, Samir likes pizza, syntax highlights for us the underlying hierarchical structure. Cool. Have you seen anything like this before? Does this remind you, did this tickle something in your brain that I'm sure Professor Johnson has talked to you about thus far in your class, because it should? You've seen this before, this idea. It's just been it's been given to you in a different framework, but the same idea persists, right? In traditional grammar, this hierarchy that's being highlighted right here in this sentence, Samir likes pizza, broken up into a noun phrase and a verb phrase, has been given to you as the subject and the predicate. And note that the subject and the predicate breaks down a sentence into two groups, into two groupings, just like this rule system does here. So there's a lot of shared practice going on here, where the NP here is the subject, this NP I should say, because there's another one down here. This NP is the subject, and this VP is what is traditionally called, in traditional grammar, is called the predicate. So even traditional grammar makes use of these kinds of hierarchical structures, but syntax doesn't stop there. It takes that idea that is shared here between syntax and traditional grammar, and it cranks it up like 6 or 7 notches. And it does tons and tons of subgrouping. So again, here's a place where I don't need you to know what's going on here at all. What I need you to see from this slide is all the different subgroupings. Subgroupings, subgroupings, everywhere you look, things are subdivided into groups. So it takes that idea and it turns it up, right? Turns it up to, cranks it up to 11, as they say, I think. Somebody said that once. Cool. Now, this is intended to give you an idea of sort of what the interworkings of the ways in which syntax works. It breaks things down and provides rules for creating these different subgroupings. Thus, to explain how sentences, here at the top level, a sentence, how sentences work in English. It's providing, again, a kind of a flowchart-esque idea. Now that we have some conception of that, what I want you to ask yourselves is why? What is this for? What does this give us? Why does this is a lot of weird formalism and a lot of weird work. What does that gain us? And I'm going to answer that in 2 ways, and that's kind of going to wrap us up for today's lecture. I'm going to show, I hope, I'm going to get into a kind of tedious example, so you're going to have to bear with me a little bit. But I'm going to show you a specific example from generative grammar, modern syntax, which provides us some sort of insights into the English language, which we may not have actually had. Right? It tells us something about our own language, which is really cool and fascinating. And in point 2, I'm going to talk again, like I promised, I'm going to zoom out and talk a little bit more about this idea of universal grammar and comparing different languages. Cool. So first, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. You guys ready? Brace yourselves here. I need the mental focus. You're going to dial it in a little bit because this example is going to be a little bit complicated. But I believe in you. We've literally never met, but I still, class, I believe in you. You got this. I'm going to provide an example, and first I'm going to give you some background. So let's just hit it. Pause if you need it. Possessives. We're going to talk about possessives. This case study that I'm going to go over for the next 5 minutes is going to have to do with possessive constructions, and it's particularly going to have to do with apostrophe S construction, like Ross's computer, with that apostrophe S there. But first, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. In generative grammar, in modern syntax, as it were, this structure over here is how you represent a noun phrase like the balcony. The balcony. Here, this, well, I guess this could probably, yeah, this D here, DP goes to D. The D in this tree that you're looking at stands for determiner. It stands for determiner. And determiners are a certain part of speech. Determiners include what are traditionally called articles, these things like, oops, this should say a, an, and the, and some other accompaniment as well, things like my, his, her, which, some, this, and no. These are all determiners. They're things that go in front of nouns. The balcony, my balcony, his balcony, her balcony, which balcony, this balcony, etc. They're those kinds of things. And this is what that structure looks like, with a D here and an N This should probably be an N instead of an NP. Don't worry about that. The balcony. Cool. So we've established what determiners are. There's these little words here that appear in front of nouns. What's particularly cool about determiners, if you think that grammar is cool, which I hope you do, is that you can't have more than one determiner. Right? This list, think about this list here that I've given you. You can't have more than one of them describing a single noun. So you can't, I should say can't, wow, I'm really good at the typos today. You can't have something like the my eraser. The my eraser. Ugh, it just cringes. I'm putting this little star here, this little asterisk, to denote that that's an ungrammatical sentence based on speaker's intuition, in this case, my intuition. I hope you share that intuition, that this is a bad sentence. The my eraser. And what's bad about that is that both the and my are determiners. And English says no. Only one determiner. You cannot have both. So again, here's another example. Which his apple? Stop here. I want you to stop and think about this sentence. Which his apple? And I want you to note that what is wrong about this sentence. What's wrong about this sentence? And this is a weird mental exercise that I'm asking you to do. To think about what about this sentence is wrong. But what I want us to realize, or at least follow along with me, is that what's wrong with this sentence isn't something about its meaning. It's not semantically weird. This is a very normal type of thing to ask. Which one of his apples? Is kind of what this is trying to say, right? Which one of his apples? Presumably he has more than one apple, and you want to ask which his apple. What's weird about that is the way that it's said. It's grammatical. What's weird about that is that English says you cannot have two determiners. It's not that that's a weird thing to ask. It's actually a very normal thing to ask. It's just grammatically incorrect. That's an odd point. That's an odd point. We can talk about that more in my little office hour at the end, if you like. Feel free to bring that up. So English has this rule that says, no, only one determiner, you can't have two. What's nice about this has an upside though, class, an upside. The upside of this is that we can use this as a test to see if a part of speech is a determiner. Because of the rule that says you can't have two determiners, we can create a test that says if you have a phrase with a determiner like this, and you try to add something to it. So say we want to add the word, testing the word this. We want to test the word this to see if it's a determiner or not. And if we add that word that we're testing, in this case this, and the result is ungrammatical, this is a clue that this is in fact a determiner. Which is cool. That's a nice way to be able to test things. So if instead we wanted to test like pretty, to see if pretty is a determiner, instead we slot in pretty here, and we find that that's in fact not ungrammatical. That's a perfectly grammatical sentence. And thus it's evidence that pretty, I changed my slides. I apologize for everything, is not a determiner. Right? It provides a test for us. Try and put the thing we're testing with a known determiner, and if it makes it ungrammatical, Yeah, you have pretty good evidence that what you're testing is in fact a determiner. Sweet. Okay, that's your background. That's all the background you need to know. You would think like, okay, Ross, that's probably the case study. That was the nitty gritty. No, 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 no. We're just getting into that. This is your background on determiners. This is a little convoluted, but let's now think of, there's gonna be a point. You just gotta wait for it. Let's consider the possessive S construction in English. So you have a sentence like this: the house's balcony. The house's balcony. And this is actually not such a bad sentence, or phrase rather, it's not a sentence, but this isn't such a bad phrase for traditional grammar, right? Probably what traditional grammar says about this is that you put the apostrophe S on the possessor, the thing that's doing the possessing, in this case the house, and it possesses this second thing, right? Here's one noun, house, that's the possessor. Here's the second noun, balcony, that's the possessed. And you put the apostrophe S on the possessor like this. Nice, nice, nice. What's less nice is when we get to sentences like this one. If we add more stuff in the middle, we get sentences like this: the house down the road's balcony. And what's odd, the problem, it's not really a problem, it's just English, but the problem with this from a traditional viewpoint is that the apostrophe S is now attaching to road, where in the previous example, the apostrophe S was attaching to house. But did the possessor actually change? Whose balcony is it here in example 1? Whose balcony? It's the house's. Houses. House is still the main possessor there. I keep doing that, I don't know why. In this one, the house down the road's balcony. Whose balcony is it? Is it the road's balcony? It's not the road's balcony. It's still the house's balcony, right? That's odd. The apostrophe S has moved positions, but the possession, the state or the relations of possession haven't changed. That's weird. And it gets worse, right? We get sentences like this: the house that you've never seen's balcony. And like, for real, writing the sentence is like a little bit painful. I wrote it so, like even you can see the red squigglies. Microsoft PowerPoint doesn't like this sentence, but it's something that I would absolutely say. The house that you've never seen's balcony. Which house's balcony? The house that you've never seen's balcony. And once again, we find that this is still the possessor, the house here, despite the moving apostrophe S. That's a weird aspect of apostrophe S. But viewed hierarchically, viewed through a hierarchical lens like the one that generative grammar and modern syntax gives to us, this actually isn't so much of a problem. It's actually fairly predictable what's going on here. And what you can see is that this apostrophe S is going after the full phrase. And probably you've already caught on to this. Traditional grammar, in fact, has already caught on to this. But it's made explicitly clear in modern syntax that this is the house is balcony. Or it's the house down the road is balcony. Or even worse, the house that you've never seen is balcony. The apostrophe S attaches to this whole phrase in some way. Or even another way you can view this is that the apostrophe S is actually more closely in a relationship with the possessed, with balcony here, than it is to the possessor, to the house. The apostrophe S always appears next to balcony. It doesn't matter how far it gets separated from this possessor, house, it likes to appear next to balcony, or on the very right edge of this whole phrase. That's cool. and very explicable with modern syntax. Let's wrap it all up here. Wrap it all up. You guys are doing good hanging in there. The other part of possessives that modern syntax gives us a window, a lens into, is what is this thing? What is apostrophe S? It doesn't act like a suffix, right? It doesn't act like a suffix like the agentive ER, like singer, ringer, bringer, whatever, where when you move the suffix, it changes the meaning, right? That's kind of a key factor of suffixes, is that they change the meaning of the word they attach to. That's not true for the apostrophe S. It's not changing the meaning of the word it's attached to. If anything, it's possibly changing the meaning of the phrase it's attached to. Changing around its word doesn't change the semantics. So it's not acting like a suffix. And if it's not a suffix, what is it? Spoiler alert, it's a determiner. Rewind a few minutes to our talk about determiners. How do we know if something is a determiner? We have a test for that. You put it with another determiner like the, or his, or my, and if it causes problems, you've got yourself a determiner. And what we see about English is that this is exactly the case. I saw the houses, the balcony. That's a weird sentence, right? I saw the house's balcony, totally fine. I saw the balcony, totally fine. But I saw the house's the balcony, or the house's my balcony, is utter garbage sentence. Utter garbage sentence. And we don't really have a good explanation for why that is in traditional grammar. But in modern syntax, we do. It violates this principle that we have already, that you can't have two determiners. Apostrophe S is a determiner here, and the is also a determiner, causing problems. Same thing, we see it in different situations. The cat's his toy. The cat's his toy, or the cat's this toy, or something like that. Any of these that you try are really terrible. So now we can encode this. Again, don't worry, don't get overloaded by the structure here, but we can encode this apostrophe S as a determiner, and a determiner that comes before balcony, the noun. This is balcony. And in addition, what this gains us is no matter what we put over here, in this side, the house, or the house down the road, this apostrophe S is going to move and attach to the latest thing. So here, this apostrophe S attaches to house, and you get the house's balcony. Here, the apostrophe S attaches to road, and you get the house down the road's balcony. Exactly where we want to get them. If you're a nerd anyway. That's kind of cool, right? It's nice when syntax explains things as eloquently as this. We have both a good explanation of what this apostrophe S is, it's a determiner, and we have a good explanation of why it changes where it's appearing. It's always appearing next to balcony at the end of this whole phrase over here, whether that's just the house or the house down the road's balcony. Isn't that cool? Hope you think that's cool. You don't have to think that's cool. If that's not cool, then fine. Just keep listening and pretend I didn't say that. But maybe you think that's cool. All right. End of long example. End of long example. Now we're moving on to the last thing I want to talk about. How much time do I have? Ooh, I'm keeping you a little late, but that's fine. The last thing I want to wrap up is talking about how the differences between syntax and traditional grammar tie in to bigger picture things. So the first, I want to talk about this in two ways, relatively quickly. The first way I want to talk about syntax in a bigger picture is that this system that we're using, that we're developing when we look at examples like this, is meant to apply to more than one language. This isn't supposed to be specific to English. English is going to arrange these, have its own set of rules, but the style of rules is the same. the methods, the approach is the same no matter what language we're looking at, which is really cool because we can draw these trees for English or we can draw these trees for French. And we can see how they differ because of this shared background. Because we're using the same approach for all languages in this syntactic approach, it gives us a good basis with which to compare the variations in the system. So that's a nice way in which we can use syntax to zoom out, lose a little bit of our Anglocentricity, and see a bigger picture. Cool. We can compare what do the trees in Mandarin look like compared to the trees of West Greenlandic. And that's just not really a question you can ask yourself in traditional grammar so well. You might be able to ask yourself, what does a passive sentence look like in West Greenlandic as opposed to a passive sentence in Mandarin? But oftentimes what you find when you try and ask questions like that is that the question itself doesn't make sense. If you ask somebody about that in West Greenlandic, it's very likely that what they're going to say is, we don't do that in Greenlandic. Passive isn't a thing that we have. Right? It's hard to compare different traditional grammar systems because we're not working with the same pieces from the same starting point. And here in syntax we are. We're actually working with the same basic building blocks, which really helps comparison points. I can look at a syntax paper written entirely in Chinese, with actual text being in Chinese, and I can skip down to these trees. I've done this before, it works. I can skip down to these trees and still understand a little bit of what's going on in this paper because of the universality of these shared approaches between languages, which is cool. It's a nice concrete way that we can view the bigger picture through a syntactic lens. The last point that I'm going to hit today is this lofty goal that we talked about at the very beginning of this lecture, which is, what does this universal grammar do for us? Is there a system of grammar? Is there a set of rules for grammar that apply to every single language? Here, what I was talking about before is the style of approach applying to every language. But can we go further and say there are actual shared rules? And the reason people want to explore this question is because they want to use it to explain a problem that has arisen in linguistics. And the problem is this. Noam Chomsky coins this problem as the poverty of the stimulus problem, which is a cool name but not very transparent. So what he says is, and what people after him since have said, is that children learn language crazy quick. Crazy quick. They learn language extremely quickly. And we need an explanation for that in some ways. Some people have said that the amount of linguistic input that you give a child is neither enough in quantity or rich enough in quality to explain how quickly they learn languages. You know how long it takes you to learn a language at the age of 20, 18 to 20 something or older? It's fine. It takes me a while. It's not getting any better, I can tell you that. It takes a really long time, and yet children go from no language to very proficient language in an extremely short period of time. That's cool, and what people are looking for is an explanation of how they do that. How do they learn language so crazy quick? And what syntax and grammar has contributed as far as a solution to this problem is that children they don't start at 0. They don't actually go from 0 to 100 when learning a language at birth. They start with something. They start with this cognitive mapping of basic building blocks of the way languages work, of the way human languages work. And what they're doing over those first 2 years is refining that universal system. So they come with a set of universal building blocks of language, and all they have to do is put them in the right arrangement. That's called universal grammar. And it's posed as a potential solution to this problem called poverty of the stimulus. I want you to think about, I said that as though it makes perfect sense. And, oh yeah, of course, children come preloaded with complicated syntactic knowledge. But I want you to realize kind of how outlandish of a claim that is. If I can put a little bit of a bias on it, right? They're saying that children are born with some knowledge of the way that human languages work. Not that they heard it in utero and thus were birthed with that knowledge. No, no, no. This claim is that they come preloaded with some of this grammatical, linguistic information even before hearing any linguistic input. And the only thing that the linguistic input does is refine their already existing knowledge base. That's a wild claim, right? Noam Chomsky, who is a big proponent, or has been at least a big proponent of this claim, goes so far as to talk about children being born with a language organ, with a linguistic organ that has this knowledge. Not like a literal one, perhaps, although maybe he means an area of the brain. That's unclear. I'm not Noam Chomsky. But he talks about it in those ways. The innateness of this proposal, the innateness of the knowledge, that is to say, in this proposal is can't be overstated there. One kind of neat expression of this idea, which maybe will help put it more into context and bring it into more focus, was called principles and parameters. This is a theory that went around a while ago. And what this says, it was essentially what I was talking about, is that children have a series of, you can think of it like this, that children have a series of switches in their brains, binary switches here. So they can either say, language is like type A, and turn the switch to the right. I don't know my directions, especially not in reverse here. Or they can say language is type B and turn the switch to the left. So they know that languages can either put the adjective in front of the noun in an adjective-noun construction, like a red dog, or it could be that they go in the other order, noun and then adjective, dog red. Children come with the innate knowledge that language can be one of these two ways. And so under this conception, what children are doing, what babies are doing, is they're going around their normal baby business, doing things that babies do, and when they hear something like this, chien rouge, this is French for dog red, they hear that and they say, aha, I heard an adjective come after a noun. I must be in a noun-adjective language, like French. I must be a French baby. And they lock in their dial to have this construction with a noun followed by an adjective. Or if instead they hear something like this, red dog, like in English, they say, aha, I'm in a language that has the adjective before the noun, and they flick their switch the other way and say, I'm in an adjective noun language. I'm an English baby now. It's a silly example. I highly doubt Noam Chomsky is probably groaning wherever he is, not in his grave. He's still alive, don't worry. He's probably groaning wherever at this explanation, but that gives you a basic idea of what universal grammar is trying to convey. It has these basic building blocks like adjectives, nouns, and all kids are trying to do is put them in the right order. Figure out whether they're French babies or English babies, I guess. Cool. It took a long time. Quick recap here, and then we're gonna end it. So what we looked at today in this lecture is what we started quickly with what the differences in approaches between traditional grammar and syntax are. Where traditional grammar focuses more on teaching and education. Syntax focuses more on this rule-creating system of all the grammatical sentences, none of the ungrammatical ones. And yeah, we followed this up with looking at some of the actual work. what does syntax actually look like? I showed you a few examples of these rules and trees. Again, please don't memorize or try and parse those apart. And then I gave you a somewhat laborious example of apostrophe S, which hopefully at the end had a bit of an aha moment of things, insights into our own language that we can get through this style of syntactic study. And then lastly, we finished this up looking at, are there bigger things? What bigger contributions of syntax in terms of looking at the world's languages, or even looking at something like language acquisition and universal grammar, as brought to you by Ross's interpretation of Noam Chomsky. Next time, we're going to change it up a little bit. We'll be a little less technical, and we're going to look at change over time. We're going to look at grammatical change within English, and we're going to look at grammatical variation as well, and how these two things are interconnected. Phew, I'm going to let you go. Hope you enjoyed this instance of not so traditional grammar. We looked at syntax very heavily today, and we'll loosen up a little bit over the next 2 sessions. So I'll catch you guys next time. I hope your interim is going fantastic. Stay safe, stay warm. Until then.